Hi, everyone on the call. This is Megan. I am having some trouble with my computer, so I'm currently on my phone trying to restart my computer and seeing if I can get my visuals up as well. So hopefully that will work. Thank you for your patience.
Can't hear anything. Check one. I can't. This is not working for me. Two. Oh, oops, she can hear me. Hmm. What to do? Mute? No. Can't hear you. Nothing. I just can't hear anything yet. It says.
Oh, okay.
Or mute? I don't know.
What if you click on the three dots?
Yeah.
You play audio stuff.
I don't know.
What about audio down here?
Where? Where, babe?
Right there, audio. What if you click on that?
That's just fine. I can't hear it. Mute.
Do on your buds?
Sure. I did not.
Yeah.
Still not working.
Recording.
Unmuted. Sure, if you want to grab the earphones. I can hear something, I think. It's not working. The dog is no longer best. Oh, well, right now. Hi, Ty. I'm doing something, Lovey. You come over here. You can come talk to them quietly.
Max wants me to take them off. Yes. Max wants me to take them off.
No?
No. We're just being patient.
Ew.
I'm doing a video call with other people.
Max wants to get kicked off.
Ah, I
All
can
right.
hear you.
You can hear me.
Yay.
Yay. Oh my gosh. Thank you everyone for your patience.
No problem. Guys.
Technology is so fun. I'm not exactly sure what happened with my computer, why I was having trouble connecting via my computer, but I'm downloaded on the app. So again, this will be a fun way to experiment with Zoom. While my computer restarts for the 5th time or so, I will try to get all the information uploaded, and hopefully I can share my screen easily just by ideally flipping the camera around. But we will definitely test this out. So again, thank you so much for your patience. Let me just pull up my notes and we'll go ahead and get started. But we can do our check-in. So last time we met, and I know there's a few people on the call who this might be your first time joining us, which is great. We did more of like a longer introduction last time, sharing more about ourselves and why we do the work we do, which was really great to hear. But generally, we like to start our groups actually with our lesson plans with a check-in. And there's really fun ways you can check in to kind of assess the needs of your students just from that first moment they're walking in the room. And one of those check-ins that we like to do is how you're feeling as the weather. So you can think of just kind of connecting into how you're feeling right now. I was feeling a little bit differently about 15 minutes ago before all this technology. So I'm a little bit of a thunderstorm right now. I'll say that, but maybe it's easing off a bit now that we got that audio fixed. So if anyone wants to jump in and share a bit about how they're feeling right now or today in the form of the weather report, that would be great.
I'll go, guys. I didn't get to meet you last week. I was busy last week. My name's Hillary. I'm from Toronto, Ontario. I have my 2 little boys interested in this. From Canada, so it's very snowy and icy. We got a big snowstorm today. But that's not stopping me. I'm still feeling happy and warm on this snowy night.
Thank you.
Hey guys, I wasn't here last week either. My name is Susanna. I'm from Smithville, Ontario, from Canada as well. And the same as Hillary, ice, snow everywhere. But I'm kind of happy for the Christmas season, so it's not going to let me down. And I'm happy to see that Christmas tree right in the back. It's cool. And good to meet everybody.
Thank you.
You can say hi. Oh, be careful.
I'll try to check in with the chat box a little bit throughout this. On my phone, I kind of have to switch throughout, so you might lose my video if I check the chat box. I'm not exactly sure. But you can always respond in the chat box as well. Check in. So the check-in is on the chat box now.
Can go. I don't know. Can you guys hear me and see me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm feeling kind of foggy. It was the first day back at work after the Thanksgiving break, so it was a really long day. And so, yeah, that's how I feel. Foggy, cloudy.
Thank you. We have another for feeling foggy as well in the chat box. Okay. A little chilly, yes. Okay. Sorry, I realize as I'm moving my finger around the screen, it's all in everybody's faces, so. Okay, someone suggested for me to clear my browsing data, so I'll try that and see what happens. But I think this is working for now for the purpose of our meeting. Did anyone have any, or is anyone else wanting to check in like the weather? There was a few people that jumped in. Okay. We can go ahead and check in on the homework. You guys had a lesson plan to submit. It could have been one that you got inspiration from the lesson plans that were pre-made, or if you wanted to develop something really unique to your community or how you're going to be applying the yoga ed principles, that was okay too. Did anyone have any questions on that, or any challenges, anything you needed to clarify? No. Pretty straightforward. For the most part. Okay. I have to sort of zoom through this to see who's all on the call. Okay. Let me pull up my outline because I had to close out all of my windows. So just give me 1 second. Well, as you guys know, when you were going through this week 2 information, it's definitely a little heavier, a little on the content side. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the brain and brain development and the nervous system, but that can be a lot of review for some of us, but also a lot of new information for us as well. And it can be kind of hard to stay focused or stay, engaged with that sort of dense material. So does anyone have any questions about week 2? So we talked about brain development, we talked about different kinds of trauma, and then the nervous system and our stress responses. So you can start from any of that, but we'll kind of just review a little bit today. I also have a few resources I was hoping to share with you through my share my screen situation on Zoom. We'll have to maybe get a little creative with that with the app, but hopefully we can make all that work. But just any general questions, you can go ahead and shout them out.
I don't have a question, but I have a compliment. Some of the visuals on the brain were some of the better ones that I've seen when studying the frontal, the lobes and whatnot. So they're very nice and clear. I like the pictures and the visuals that you guys had. They're some of the better ones that I've ever seen when studying this kind of stuff. So thank you.
Well, thank you for saying that. Yes, the brain can be really complicated depending on your interest level in it too. We can, when I teach students about the brain, because I think it can be really helpful, in therapy practice, but also just in life in general, of understanding sort of the basic components of your brain. I use a lot of the metaphors that are referenced in from the Dr. Dan Siegel book, The Whole Brain Child, which is referenced a lot in the presentations, and that's kind of where the whole upstairs, downstairs brain metaphor comes into. And if you guys haven't read that book, highly recommend it for just anyone who might interact with children, whether you're a parent or a teacher. It really is helpful for just explaining what's happening in the developing brain, but it also provides great tools for then parents or teachers to help explain to kids what's going on in their brain. So that's a really good resource. It even has sort of some scripts or kind of comic strips that you could read together with your kid or your students to help them understand what's going on. Because I think while it's really complicated and abstract for us to learn about this, it's important to remember that kids don't always even have the vocabulary for how they're feeling and how to explain that to us. And so one thing we're always trying to encourage you all to remember is that when we're asking kids to calm down or relax, they don't always have the understanding of what works for them. You know, we're all still probably figuring out what works for us. So asking kids to do that can be a lot. They might not know what's actually happening in their systems.
Right.
I was a very anxious child growing up, just a little more sensitive, I think, than other kids. And so I would have appreciated an explanation of like, oh, your heart is racing and you're getting hot for a survival reason. Like your body is doing what it's supposed to do to keep you safe. You're not going crazy. That would have been really nice as a kid. So I hope that the content was explained clearly for that, because I think if we can understand and digest it a little bit more, we can help other people explain it to other people as well.
Right.
Yeah. How about the different types of trauma? Does anyone have any comments or any resources or anything that they were surprised about the different types of trauma or anything like that? And as a review, if maybe some of you looked at this content, last week or the week before, our types of trauma include like a shock trauma. So that's going to be a situation that kind of has the beginning and an end. It could have been a car crash. It could have been like hearing or witnessing something really scary in your neighborhood. That's sort of a one-time incident. Having a scary medical procedure happen, that can be sort of a shock trauma. Then we might have developmental or complex or cumulative trauma, which is sort of ongoing, and that's going to be your physical abuse, your neglect, your emotional abuse, sexual abuse, if it's happening kind of continuously throughout your childhood or development. Intergenerational trauma was the trauma that hasn't been resolved from our caregivers and maybe the caregivers before them, which has impacted sort of the cycles that we might be into, which could be poverty, it could be cycles of violence, parts of our family history that were just never resolved that can be passed down to us. And then historical trauma and shared community trauma, that can be a lot of racism, things that people experience systemically, and marginalized communities or communities that have experienced shared trauma, like Native American populations or indigenous populations all over the world that have had these experiences as a community. So did anyone have any comments on the types of trauma or anything to share about that?
I was really interested to read a little bit about or when we were hearing about where if you're not able to like process that trauma, how it kind of stays with you, so that later experiences like something small can like trigger that and bring it right back to like in that moment. And I think of like some of the kids that we work with that from our perspective, it looks like it shouldn't have caused such a reaction, like the reaction that it caused, but the reaction is so heightened and we just can't understand why. But this kind of helped to kind of put that into perspective, that we don't know like everything that they've been through, that and what they're holding on to and how they haven't been able to really process that and get that out of their system. So it's still being held on. So I just found that very interesting.
Yes, and the research and the effects on all different parts of our body is still ongoing, which is exciting that, in mental health and science, there's always sort of trends, and trends get the funding. So it is exciting that trauma is sort of this big buzzword right now. And we're still getting a lot of this great research on what's actually happening physically in the body. And I think it's so important for if we're having these physical responses in our stress systems, so our, like I said, our heartbeat is racing, our breath rate is increasing, our blood pressure is up, we need some tools to tap into those parts of our system. So that's why yoga just fits in so perfectly with learning how to regulate those systems. Because if anyone has ever tried to speak logically to a child who's in distress, I think we all know that that doesn't quite work so well. So that's just not where their thinking is lying, right? They're in survival mode, and it doesn't affect how they're functioning and able to, you know, connect to the world around them. And thank you for sharing. Okay, so just a fun review. Does everyone want to hold up the size of the brain that they know of from the lesson? If you're not there yet, it's okay. Right? See, some people got their 2 fists together. I have to kind of explore through the app. But yeah, basically, roughly around 2 fists put together is your brain. Weighs about 3 pounds. I don't know if this was mentioned, but there's still like questionable research on this too, when the brain actually stops developing. I can't remember if that was reviewed in the content, but does anyone know when the brain stops developing or what they think?
Probably not till 18, 19, 20.
Mm-hmm. It's actually about like 25 is
Wow.
some of the research coming out. So yeah, if you think about that, you know, all of these sort of developmental milestones are happening, and you know, I'm sure there's arguments that it's even a little bit later in life that the brain is still developing and forming. And I think one of the other, you know, pieces of information that's really helpful when you hear about trauma and all the negative things that's happening in the body is remembering that we do have bodies that are really resilient to stress, and we have neuroplasticity, so we're able to regenerate parts of our brain that are that aren't utilized as much. So they've done like really amazing studies on meditation and, you know, very serious meditators, so they have really good data from like monks and Buddhist monks who've developed more gray matter in certain parts of their brain, which gray matter is kind of like the engine, the gasoline in your brain to get things going. So that's something I always like to remember when we're kind of diving into the heavy trauma aspect and all the, you know, there was that long list of trauma symptoms, I think, that Chelsea reads out, and you're just like, oh my gosh, like how do we combat all of this? It can be a little overwhelming. So kind of falling back on the tools that we're teaching the students and helping them figure out what works for them, because it's so individual. I'll have so many students that say breathing doesn't do anything for them, it doesn't help. But actually, when I'm able to kind of explain the science to them and make it not about like you're doing it wrong or something like that, it can actually sink in a little bit differently for them. So I like to tap into all the different ways that we learn, because it, you know, like I'm a social worker, so I'm always talking about breathing, and I get a lot of eye rolls and all that. But when I actually have the science to back it up for some students, it can be really helpful. So does anyone have any fun ways that they've taught sort of brain development or any of this information to kids? Anything that they've done that's fun, or like a easy way to explain it, or simplistic, not easy? I have to keep an eye on the chat box. Keep forgetting.
I'm hoping to find and learn more easy ways, because I find here, at least in Ontario, Canada, in the schools, they're just starting to talk about it. The teachers don't spend enough time on it yet. They're starting to realize the importance and starting to teach mindfulness in the schools,
Mm-hmm.
but not yet.
Yeah.
So I'm looking forward to hearing some easy or simplistic ways of teaching younger kids.
Yeah, well, I mean, I have some, but I was just seeing if anyone else did. I like to start off with like the three major parts of the brain as sort of your reptile brain. So that's going to be the brain stem and your limbic system. And thinking about a reptile, like a lizard, what does that really need to, what is its really daily concerns? What is a lizard worried about, right? It's worried about survival, not getting eaten, making sure it stays safe, staying away from predators, maybe finding a mate one day, survival. Those are the goals of a lizard in their daily activity. They're not really worried about getting a job, or they're not stressed. They might be sad. I don't want to discount lizards, but basically they're not too worried about a lot of things going on besides survival. And then we can kind of increase or go to the next level up and use like a dog as an example, because a dog, for the emotional part of our brain, so even more in that limbic system, they're the ones, dogs have a little bit more capability. They're able to learn. They can be trained, hopefully. They can detect emotion. They kind of can understand. They definitely know when you're mad at them. They might know when you're sad. They show happiness. They definitely, I've never seen a lizard wag its tail. So dogs wag their tail. They're able to express themselves a little bit more. It's kind of that emotional part of your brain. And then the cerebral cortex is your human brain. And that's the part that applies the logic, that can figure out and problem solve. So kind of just using those three major parts of the brain, I find really helpful. We've even used like Play-Doh, where we can actually make, like using 3 different colors of Play-Doh and kind of make a little brain together. I might have some pictures of that I can share when we get the Facebook group going. So that's a good way. Chelsea has shared in her adolescent group, because I work in an elementary school, so I pretty much use this content mostly with the young ones, but I've had experience with adolescents too, where she'll actually have them put on like a swim cap, and they'll map out the parts of the brain on each other with like a Sharpie, which is really fun. So just kind of a way to get students engaged. So if it's relevant to your yoga lesson plan, if that's something you feel comfortable bringing in, or you feel like it's going to be helpful, I think it could be really a fun way to engage students in understanding their brain a little bit better.
So I don't have a teaching background. I have like 2 cousins that are social workers, so I'm sort of coming right off of a yoga training and this opportunity with teens. But so I don't know if this is useful for people on the call, but the tie-in with the chakras is really interesting. Like you can really tie in like the grounding chakras, the reptile brain, all the way through. And I know there's like colors and music and smells that are attached to that. So when I thought about like, it's really like teens into the mid-20s of the LGBTQ that I would be teaching. And so they're sort of interested in that, like into the moonlight meditation, but I'm sure young children to be like, whoa, lady, like, I don't get it. Like, but I don't know. There was just an interesting parallel for me to tie in.
Yeah, I think you could totally tap into that, even like how the different chakras relate to the different parts of the brain, or like color coding it, right? So you could say, oh, this is the part of the brain that's connected to smell, or something like that. That'd be super cool.
Like the dog, is like the emotion, you have the ego, and you have the reptile who just needs to exist, all the way up to that like human thinking, 7th chakra, that kind of thing. But
yeah, that's a great idea. Thanks for sharing. Awesome. Cool. I'm going to add that to our notes. Brain development and the chakras. Okay. Awesome. So feeling pretty good about the brain. Definitely, don't feel like you have to know everything about it. I find those kind of 3 major parts, especially if you're going to be, communicating it back to kids, to be really helpful. I also find that this is the content that could provide a lot of rationale for your programming. So if I know some of us on the call are maybe trying to write grants, or convince administrators why that this is valuable. And sometimes more administrators they resonate more with, this sort of thinking of the science behind yoga and why it's helpful. So definitely, take what you want from it. When we create the Facebook group, we can share a lot more resources on this as well. Because I find that there's so many different modalities of understanding this content. There's so many great TED Talks. There's so many great books. But finding all the different ways that will resonate with people, with you, and with your stakeholders to be really helpful. Has anyone heard of the ACE study, like kind of before getting into trauma research for trauma-informed yoga? A few thumbs ups. Again, sorry if anyone has added to the chat. I keep trying to be mindful to check that. No, okay.
I can see it. Do you want me to just do you want me to just be like, hey, there's a chat? So you don't have to keep talking? Okay, yeah.
Thanks. Teamwork.
Of course.
Yeah, so the ACE study is a sort of the benchmark that really connected sort of the science world and the mental health and mind world, because it connected trauma with health outcomes. So even just understanding that connection that we all kind of get, but we didn't have necessarily the data to back it up, was really helpful. And there's a really amazing TED Talk by Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris. Let me see if I can just get it pulled up so that you guys can, I'll just turn my phone around to see if we can get it on the recording. Oops, that's the commercial for the YouTube. We'll just mute that. Has anyone seen this TED Talk before by Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris?
No.
No. Oh, it's so good. So she, right now, she's the Surgeon General of California. But when this TED Talk was recorded, let me see, in 2015, she just opened, she was the clinical director for a clinic in the San Francisco Bay Area in a low-income neighborhood where they were seeing really high rates of ADHD diagnosis, which is a lot of crossover with ADHD and trauma in terms of the symptomology and the externalizing behaviors that a lot of us see and think of ADHD. So let me see if this will work. This might be a silly idea, but we'll just go with it for now.
And even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. Folks who are exposed in very high doses have triple the lifetime risk of heart disease and lung cancer, and a 20-year difference in life expectancy. Whoa. Doctors today are not trained in routine screening or treatment. Now, the exposure I'm talking about is not a pesticide or packaging chemical. It's childhood trauma. Okay, what kind of trauma am I talking about here? I'm not talking about failing a test or losing a basketball game. I am talking about threats that are so severe or pervasive that they literally get under our skin and change our physiology. Things like abuse or neglect, or growing up with a parent who struggles with mental illness or substance dependence. Now, for a long time, I viewed these things in the way I was trained to view them, either as a social problem, refer to social services, or as a mental health problem, refer to mental health services. And then something happened to make me rethink my entire approach. When I finished my residency, I wanted to go someplace where I felt really needed, someplace where I could make a difference. So I came to work for California Pacific Medical Center, one of the best private hospitals in Northern California. And together, we opened a clinic in Bayview, Hunters Point, one of the poorest, most underserved neighborhoods in San Francisco. Now, prior to that point, there had been only one pediatrician in all of Bayview to serve more than 10,000 children. So we hung a shingle and we were able to provide top quality care regardless of ability to pay. It was so cool. We targeted the typical health disparities: access to care, immunization rates, asthma hospitalization rates, and we hit all of our numbers. We felt very proud of ourselves. But then I started noticing a disturbing trend. A lot of kids were being referred to me for ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But when I actually did a thorough history and physical, what I found was that for most of my patients, I couldn't make a diagnosis of ADHD. Most of the kids I was seeing had experienced such severe trauma that it felt like something else was going on. Somehow, I was missing something important. Now, before I did my residency, I did a master's degree in public health. And one of the things that they teach you in public health school is that if you're a doctor and you see 100 kids that all drink from the same well, and 98 of them develop diarrhea, you can go ahead and write that prescription for dose after dose after dose of antibiotics, or you can walk over and say, what the hell is in this well? So I began reading everything that I could get my hands on about how exposure to adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. And then one day, my colleague walked into my office and he said, Dr. Burke, have you seen this? In his hand was a copy of a research study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. That day changed my clinical practice and ultimately my career. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study is something that everybody needs to know about. It was done by Dr. Vince Felitti at Kaiser and Dr. Bob Onda at the CDC, and together they asked 17,500 adults about their history of exposure to what they called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. Those include physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, parental mental illness, substance dependence, incarceration, parental separation or divorce, or domestic violence. For every yes, you would get a point on your ACE score. And then what they did was they correlated these ACE scores against health outcomes. What they found was striking. Two things. Number one, ACEs are incredibly common. 67% of the population had at least one ACE, and 12.6%, 1 in 8, had 4 or more ACEs. The second thing that I found was that there was a dose-response relationship between ACEs and health outcomes. The higher your ACE score, the worse your health outcomes. For a person with an ACE score of 4 or more, their relative risk of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease was 2.5 times that of someone with an ACE score of 0. For hepatitis, it was also 2.5 times. For depression, it was 4.5 times. For suicidality, it was 12 times. A person with an ACE score of 7 or more had triple the lifetime risk of lung cancer and 3.5 times the risk of ischemic heart disease, the #1 killer in the United States of America. Well, of course, this makes sense. You know, some people looked at this data and they said, come on, you know, you have a rough childhood, you're more likely to drink and smoke and do all these things that are going to ruin your health. This isn't science. This is just bad behavior. It turns out this is exactly where the science comes in. We now understand better than we ever have before how exposure to early adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. It affects areas like the nucleus accumbens, the pleasure and reward center of the brain that is implicated in substance dependence. It inhibits the prefrontal cortex, which is necessary for impulse control and executive function, a critical area for learning. And on MRI scans, we see measurable differences in the amygdala, the brain's fear response center. So there are real neurologic reasons why folks exposed to high doses of adversity are more likely to engage in high-risk behavior. And that's important to know. But it turns out that even if you don't engage in any high-risk behavior, you're still more likely to develop heart disease or cancer. The reason for this has to do with the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis.
So I'm going to stop it there because it gets a little more brainy. But as you can see, this is another really, really great TED Talk, or just another good resource for sort of better understanding. And you can just like hear the passion in her about how important that this understanding and this knowledge is. And she's got a great resource website as well. So I'll make sure to share that in the follow-up email. Was anyone reminded that they had actually seen that one before? No. Okay, cool. So just for the sake of time, and I know since we started late, otherwise we probably would have watched that whole TED Talk, but I don't want to take up more of your time than the 8 p.m. time slot. Just going to make a note to send the TED Talk out. But basically she kind of goes on to speak about how this information should have changed our medical approaches, but it hasn't quite made that shift yet. And there's still something that prevents sort of the mind-body connection from really being explored. For some reason, it keeps getting impeded. I think a lot of it is because some of the research on the mind is very qualitative. You know, we can do these depression scales and anxiety scales, but measuring how good someone is feeling is really hard. So the research is still developing and growing in the trauma approach. But I do want to make sure we talk a little bit about the stress response systems and how the differences between the normal stress response and the toxic stress response. Just make sure that that was clear in the content and that no one has any really pertinent questions or anything that really just didn't make sense, because we can go through a couple examples too. So if anyone has questions on the...
Quickly, just with the chat, that someone had asked for the link, so I found it and shared it. And then Jody had said that actually she had realized she had seen it, the video. So that's what's going on.
Thank you. That's what's going on. That's the chat report. Awesome. Thank you. Okay. And actually your homework for this week is the stress response worksheet that was at the very end of all of the content. You should have been able to download that and explore that. The information is definitely in your teacher's guide as well, so hint, hint. But in terms of the normal stress responses, I can share an example of just sort of one that always comes back to me of how, and it helps me make sense of this information. So for some reason, one of my triggers is seeing the light on for my voicemail when I walk in the morning in my office, because usually like a late night voicemail isn't positive. So I usually have this initial like heat rush from my heart, and my heartbeat might go up, and I can think about the fight, flight, or freeze response in terms of like I might tackle that right away. I'm going to listen to it immediately. I might flight and avoid it for another 30 minutes or so, or I might freeze and just completely forget about it and never check it, right? I'm not going to ever deal with that. I usually do end up checking the voicemail. Sometimes it was a telemarketer or something not important. Sometimes it was. But I'm able to sort of recover and move on with the rest of my morning. It doesn't, prevent me from doing my job. I'm able to have the stress response, react to it, and respond and recover. So that's an example from me. Does anyone have like a normal stress response that they feel comfortable sharing that sort of makes sense for that arc of response in our body?
I feel it almost every morning at about 7:59, going out the door with 4 kids. I like to be out the door at a certain time. So if the time is a certain time, I'm kind of like, I try to breathe through it, but I always, every morning around the same time, I feel that jolt of energy. I don't want to be late. And every morning I have the same thoughts. Don't want to be late. Let's go. Let's do this.
Right. And after you're kind of able to get everyone where they need to be, do you feel that ease?
I'm fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have time to get to work after, but I don't want the kids to be late I want to be there.
Sure.
On the bell. So.
Yeah. And thinking about that, I mean, I work with a lot of students who have some attendance issues and tardiness, and it almost becomes like, there's some shame in that too, of like, oh, these parents feel like they can't get their kids there on time. The front desk is judging them and all that stuff. So there's a lot of that.
It's my own
Not
issue.
just getting out the door. Yeah, it's like, I'm a good parent. So it goes all the way to there. Yeah. So exactly. Well, thank you for sharing. Does anyone else have like a normal stress response that they don't mind sharing? Okay. Well, you can kind of see how a little bit of stress can actually help us in getting out the door on time, or still doing my job and checking the voicemail, not being so fearful of it. But when we are having this chronic stress, and that actually, she goes into the TED Talk a little bit more on what's actually happening when these cortisol levels are ever increased in our brain. And you can even just think about it like a muscle. So the part of our brain that is being activated in a continuous state is going to be the quicker one to respond. And we want that to happen. We don't want our reflexes to be numbed down, because our cerebral cortex is the more logical part of our brain. We want the information to go brainstem, limbic, logic for survival. So if we're touching, something hot, we don't want our cerebral cortex to be the one in charge saying like, wow, this is burning. I think I smell flesh and I should probably move my hand. Like we don't want that. We want the brainstem to just tell us to move our hand instinctively. So there's purpose to that. And I think that's really important to remember too, for the students that we see with a lot of that long checklist of symptoms of externalizing behaviors, and even the internalizers, the ones who might fly under the radar. Those are the ones who are appeasing or trying to control everything, make their life perfect, that they're adapting the best way their brain knows how. So they have learned that this is the things they need to do to survive. And I think when we get that concept and we're able to sort of reframe how we see some of the behaviors or some of the challenges that might come up in our classes, it's going to help us respond to them a little bit differently. So when we get into the lessons on, behavior management and classroom management, remembering that this science is there, these stress responses are involuntary, as much as it might seem like they're trying to manipulate us and control the situation. This is a learned behavior for their survival. It's worked for them to get through really tough times and really scary times. And the way our brain inputs data is reflexively. So it's going to go through those systems that tell them to respond right away. And so I think that just helps us really reframe how we then respond to them. Just making sure. So I don't know if this was included in the study. Sorry, again, I would have shared my screen for this. This graph, if you can see it, try to make sure, let me make sure I'm going the right way. There it is. So how things are being developed in a typical brain, where you have survival is sort of done right at the beginning, you're good to go, you're going to start getting into your regulation, you're able to develop social and emotionally, and then your cognitive abilities start to increase as you get older. And when we have developmental trauma, our survival brain is really the one in charge. Our ability to regulate is diminished. We're not quite there for social and emotional, and our cognitive abilities are definitely not as sharp. So we're just not we're not able to input the content in like a regular classroom as much when we've had sort of these pervasive developmental traumas throughout our life. But again, that makes sense for what people have had to do to adapt to their environment. Okay, so Any questions on that? Any other resources that people have on like the nervous system? Anything anyone wants to share? I find the nervous system's pretty hard to teach kids. One thing that I have done just to kind of get, and you could definitely do this, you know, in your yoga classes when you're kind of getting them maybe more energized in a really active game, just getting them to notice, put your hand on your heart and feel how many beats per minute, or just noticing how warm you're getting, why that this is happening. You know, some of the games in the trauma-informed course aren't very competitive, but you could consider maybe adding a musical chairs kind of game or something like that maybe stimulates a little bit of stress in the room, a safe stress when you've kind of created a good rapport with your group or something like that, and kind of talk about what that feels like in the moment in a way that's safe. They're not going to be telling their trauma history to their whole group, but maybe they can kind of explore what stress feels like in the body. I find a game like with a timer can be helpful for that, like catchphrase or heads up or something like that. That's pretty fun. You could even probably do heads up with yoga poses or something like that, and sort of kind of find ways to get their energy going, maybe a little bit of a safe trauma or safe stress response happening in their body, just so they can kind of actually feel it in a way that's not so triggering.
And people were thinking that we don't have it, and they'd love if you could share it as a PDF.
The chart?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I will definitely share that. Let me do that right now. Copy. Add that to the notes. Thank you. Okay. Awesome. So it's 7:54. So I just want to leave any room for any questions, any logistical questions regarding the homeworks or any troubleshooting with technology minus the Zoom meetings or anything like that. Everything's going okay. I think that there was some follow-up on the syllabus question for people who might want to use the holidays to get a little ahead on some of the homework assignments. Was that ever sent out? No? Okay, so I'll follow up on that to see where we are with the syllabus. Okay. Awesome. And then as far as the Facebook group, is that something everyone's okay with joining? I don't want to, if you're not on Facebook, you don't have to join Facebook just to be a part of this group. But if you feel comfortable joining, we'll probably have that set up soon and see what we can do. Just we'll send the link out for the group and you'll just join. It'll be private and you don't have to friend me or anything like that to be a part of it. But we can share some of the resources that are on the calls, but also anyone else. So the people who are watching this a little bit later, they might have great ideas to share, so they can add to that platform as well. Yeah, anything else? No. Okay, well, the next time I'm your host, hopefully with better internet connection or computer issues will be resolved. And it is December 23rd will be my next hosting. Chelsea will be the next 2 weeks. But I do want to honor that that's a night of Hanukkah. So if that's something you celebrate, if that's a part of your culture, please do not feel obligated to join the call, spend time with your family and friends. But yeah, I really appreciate everyone's patience with the technology. My computer seems to be kind of looping through internet connections, so I'm guessing that was maybe the issue, but I really do appreciate that. And I appreciate all of your voices here tonight. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, well, have a great night.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye. Good night.
Bye.